Hello everybody, and today I'm going to be talking about coral reefs as for a project in school. And I'm also going to talk about the things that endanger the reef, but we'll talk about that later, which is over in that direction. So, let's first talk about coral and the problem that's presented to us right now. Okay, so the coral is a living creature. Most people don't see it as that. Most people are like, oh, look at the cute rock formations in the sea. People just don't get that coral is a living, breathing, eating creature. In fact, basically it's a mass of polyps, which are basically a hydrate in a cup. So it's like going back and looking at microorganisms and seeing how the hydras eat, how they have these tentacles and they just kind of grab at the particles. But anyways, there are two types of coral. There are stony corals and soft corals. Now the soft corals are mainly current dependent on their food, in that it's basically like an anemone, where you'll see it sway in the water as it collects the food from the currents, and the stony corals are just kind of there to withstand everything. Stony corals are what really builds up the reefs, because that's what the reef's mainly composed out of. Now the corals are made out of calcium carbonate, which is a mineral that's often used in formations such as rocks like this. But let's move on with that to the factor that keeps coral alive. Now coral by itself would just die. It needs to have a specific photosynthetic algae called zooxanthellae. Now the zooxanthellae is almost kind of absorbed into the into the coral. Sorry, got a little stuttery there. And the coral, once it takes in the zooxanthellae, it'll put it to basically the top layer of the coral, almost like your skin. And the zooxanthellae not only provides vital nutrients to that coral, but also provides pigment. That's why you see all these nice reds and yellows and all these different colors in the ocean, because of the pigmentation of the zooxanthellae. And that's where one of the problems comes up. There's a thing called coral bleaching. Now there's a lot of other diseases that we could talk about, but coral bleaching is when zooxanthellae gets expelled from the coral itself. Now, you might be thinking, why does that matter to someone like me? I'm not in a coastal area, I don't depend on it for tourism, but we'll get to that in just a short bit. Now, the expellation of zooxanthellae, like the diseases, the different funguses and viruses that the coral can get, which there's not a lot of cures for, and you can't regrow coral. It's not like you can find a coral polyp and just stick it onto the dead carcass of the coral and wait for it to grow. It just doesn't work that way. In fact, the way the corals reproduce is vital to their survival, which is mass spawning, where a lot of egg cells and sperm cells go into the ocean, whooshing around, colliding, creating polyps, and the polyps swim around until they find an anchor point to go and hopefully grow. But the zooxanthellae is a very specific, and I want to say fragile, organism, because it's very temperature dependent. If it gets to a certain heat, it dies. If it gets too cold, it also dies. But there are species that have been able to withstand the cold, as we know, because coral has survived throughout the Ice Age. In fact, coral is almost one of the oldest known things to live on Earth, besides sponges. But sponges are also basically a part of the coral reef, which brings it to predators, but that's not the reason why we need a coral reef or why the coral reef is dying. Coral reefs everywhere are being bleached. No, it's not like the shops where they dump a bunch of Clorox off their docks waiting for the coral to bleach. It is where the coral is being expelled with the zooxanthellae, which is the pigment, yada yada yada. I explained this before. And so we are left with, how do we help the coral? But in order to help the coral, usually you want something a little back, like what benefits does a coral give us? Say you're in Ohio. Coral still affects the way you live. I mean, all the coastal communities can tell you, especially if they have coral reefs near them, how important reefs are for tourism. But they don't really get at how the coral is definitely like a rainforest. There are many species of organisms, sorry. Once again, a little bit of a speech thing, it's alright, it's not too permanent. But, organisms that can lead to certain cures. It is not limited to, but includes stuff like Alzheimer's and cancer, which is very, very important, especially in today's society. So, let's get on with a little bit more of a reason why the corals are dying. Let's start off with the average spiel about global warming. Now, like I said, zooxanthellae is a very delicate creature in which it can't survive certain temperatures, like whether it's too hot or too cold. There's my hand. And so global warming really affects some of the more tropical coral reefs, whereas the zooxanthellae is adapted to the water around it. All of a sudden it's getting hotter at such a rate where it can't adapt any faster, and it just poof. Sorry about some of the background noise, by the way. And so that's a problem, even though global warming has been scientifically proven to be kind of false. I mean, we do have the greenhouse effect, which does increase almost the insulation of Earth, but there are trends of like where the Earth gets hotter and the Earth gets cooler, mainly because of our relative location to the sun. But that's a whole nother theory, in which I explained in one of my papers, actually very briefly. But let's go to the other problems, such as pollution and silt. Usually when you farm, you use a lot of manure, and then when it rains, that manure gets washed down to the streams, which can end up in the ocean, making basically a cloud. You know that when there's a cloud blocking the sun, you're not getting any sun. Same thing when there's silt in the ocean. When there's silt in the ocean, it blocks light to those that need it, such as a photosynthetic algae, which is zooxanthellae. It needs the sunlight, and if that's blocked off for enough time, it's going to die. And then the coral will die, and then we're all in trouble. Well, for that chunk of coral. There's a lot of corals, and there's a lot of different things that make reefs, such as barrier reefs, like the Great Barrier Reef, atoll reefs, which are reefs basically fringing. It's basically a fringing reef with a sunken island. Like there's a hole that just leads down to a good distance away because the island was somehow obliterated. But let's get back to some of the things that causes damage to these reefs. Reefs, they've been living for a long time, and we're contributing a great amount of detrimental effects to the reef, such as tourism. Now, tourism is great for coastal communities, but if you get a careless diver that steps on the corals, that can mean the end of the coral. At least that he steps on, because they're very delicate, like I've said before. Corals, once they snap off, they're not a starfish, they can't regrow. Unfortunately, otherwise, we wouldn't have to do this project. But another thing that contributes to coral depletion is dynamite fishing. Now, dynamite fishing is where somebody lights up a stick of dynamite, tosses it in the water, tells their friends to cover the earth, and there's a big boom, and all these small fish come bubbling to the top. Now, that's not really a great thing to do. Either way, it's illegal. There's a lot of things that are, a lot of laws, in fact, that are against it, but of course people don't listen. I mean, that's why there's people robbing banks and such like that. They don't care about laws. They're rebels. But that shock wave that's produced that concusses a fish and kills some species of fish is enough to break off coral. And once coral is damaged, it's game over for the coral. It can't regrow. Even though coral is known to grow at a general rate, but once it's been impacted like that, it's done. And the main problem is that a lot of the corals that are being damaged are small polyps that are basically the offspring of coral, which really entails the future of coral itself. So, all in all, coral doesn't have a great future, especially the way that we're polluting the oceans. We have great garbage patches, not only the great one in the Pacific, because it's not all that great because it causes a lot of harm, but wherever the currents seem to mass together, there's a garbage patch in the ocean. Thanks to us humans who don't like to actually recycle and throw away things. We like to toss it in nature and say, deal with it. But those are just some reasons why the corals are depleting. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, how can I help it? Now, unfortunately, you're not like the octonauts where you can just go down and be an animated animal and fix the ocean. No, it's really difficult to actually help coral. You can't fix coral, but you can prevent the stuff from happening to the coral. There are different foundations where you can raise money. There's this, and that. There's stuff where you can help enforce a law. Say you're in California or Florida or somewhere where there's a reef or coast. You can help spot dynamite fishers, haul them in, probably collect some sort of bounty. Some cool things like that. But I guess that pretty much sums up the project we had. We had to research coral. We had to write down zooxanthellae so many times that I could probably write it in my sleep. And we had to explain the detrimental effects that we are doing to it and why the zooxanthellae is being expelled. I want to thank you all for watching this, and have a great rest of your night.